Wyoming Territory, May 1883. The wind blew dust across the dry earth as a wagon rolled slow down the lane leading to the Triple V Ranch, wheels creaking under the weight and wear. A tall man stood near the corral fence, one hand on the post, the other resting casually on his belt buckle. He shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun and watched the wagon come closer. The woman driving it sat straight despite the heat, her jaw set with quiet determination. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a thick braid, and there was a long scar that ran from the corner of her left eyebrow down to her cheekbone, pale against the tanned skin. Behind her, packed tight in the wagon, sat 6 children, ranging from a baby in her arms to a boy just entering his teenage years. Their clothes were worn but clean, their eyes wide, some curious, some wary. The man pushed off the fence and walked toward them, dust rising around his boots. When the wagon stopped, the woman did not speak first. She just looked at him, steady and guarded. "You must be Miss," he began, voice low and even. "Mara Hensley," she said. "We came from Abilene, heard there was work, heard you were hiring for the house and fields." The man nodded once. "Name's Owen Vance. You found the right place." She held his gaze. "I've got 6 children, no husband. He died in Kansas 2 years ago. We are not charity." Owen looked past her, meeting the eyes of the oldest boy, then the little girl beside him, then the baby Mara held close. Something in his face softened. "You're all welcome here," he said simply. Mara blinked once, like she was not sure she heard him right. "I mean it," Owen added. "There's room in the bunkhouse for you and the children until we fix up the old north cabin. I'll pay fair for cleaning, cooking, whatever you feel fit to do. The children can help with light chores if they want. They'll get schooling too. You do not owe me more than that." Mara gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles white. "You do not know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know what it is to be alone and still keep going." She hesitated, then nodded once. Owen reached up to help her down from the wagon. She hesitated again, then passed the baby into his arms. He took the little girl, barely more than a year old, carefully, as if she were made of glass. The baby blinked up at him, then gave a small sneeze. He chuckled. "Well now, that's a fine welcome." Mara stepped down from the wagon and took back her daughter, but not before their hands brushed. She looked up at him, surprised at the warmth in his palm, how steady he felt. It was then that one of the children, a boy of about 9 with sharp eyes and a stubborn chin, climbed down behind her. "My name's Samuel," he said, sticking out his hand. "I help with horses." Owen shook it firmly. "Good to meet you, Samuel." The rest followed, 5 more names quick on their heels. Sarah, the oldest at 13, serious and quiet. Stephen, the youngest boy who stayed close to his mother's side. Sadie, a girl of about 7, cheerful despite the long ride. Seth, just 5, clung to Mara's skirt when Owen knelt to greet him. And the baby, Susanna, who had already fallen asleep in her mother's arms. Owen showed them the bunkhouse, brought water for washing, and told Mara she could rest before supper. "Plenty of time to talk about work tomorrow," he said. "You made it this far. That counts for something." That evening he watched from the porch as Mara stood near the corral, arms folded as the children chased each other through the dust. She looked tired, but she smiled when Seth picked a wildflower and gave it to her. Owen stepped down and walked up beside her. "You need anything?" he asked. She looked up at him. "No, you already gave more than most would." He nodded but said nothing. "You really mean to let us stay?" she asked after a moment. "I said you're welcome here. I meant it." She looked at him for a long while. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because you came with 6 kids and a scar and you still stood tall." "That tells me everything I need to know." Her breath caught slightly. She turned away, blinking hard. "I do not expect anything from you," she said. "You do not have to." He tipped his hat. "Plenty of room here for all of you." That is all. Inside the bunkhouse, Sarah helped her younger siblings settle in. Mara stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the man walk back to his house. There was something in the way he moved, strong, steady, patient, like the ground itself. That night, as the children slept, Mara sat alone on the small bunk, fingers brushing the scar on her cheek. She had not spoken of how she got it in years. She had not trusted a man since her husband died in the fire that nearly took her too. But when Owen looked at her, he did not flinch. He looked straight at her and just said, "You're all welcome here." She rested her hand on Susanna's back and whispered, "Maybe we are." Outside, the Wyoming wind whistled low through the trees, but for the first time in a long time, it did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a beginning. The morning sun slid slow over the hills, pulling gold across the sagebrush and lighting dew on the corral rails. Mara stepped out of the bunkhouse with her sleeves rolled and Sarah trailing close behind. The others were still inside, still asleep or near to it. But Sarah had risen early without being asked, her hands already rubbed raw from the washboard the day before. Owen was by the barn, fitting a new strap to the harness of the draft mare. He didn't glance over when Mara approached, but his voice carried plain. "You any good with bread dough?" She crossed her arms. "Good enough to feed 7 mouths without waste." He gave a single nod and spoke without looking up. "Flour's in the cellar behind the main house. Stove's in working order. You'll want to stoke it half an hour before you start." Mara hesitated, then asked, "You keep any root vegetables, carrots and onions? Some potatoes still good from winter." "Garden's fallow, though. I'll see to that once the frost's out." Only then did he meet her eyes. "You'll stay then?" She didn't answer right away. "We're not passing through, that's all I can say for now." Owen accepted that without a word. He adjusted the bridle, then stepped back, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Found a sewing kit in my mother's old trunk. You'll want it if the boys keep tearing sleeves like they did yesterday. I'll mend what I can." Mara watched him a long moment. "What happened to your mother? She passed 6 winters back." "Sorry," he shrugged once, the kind of gesture that carries weight beneath it. "She would have liked you." Mara looked away, unsure what to say to that. She turned toward the house. "I'll start the fire." "Bread won't bake itself." The kitchen was cooler than outside, the stone walls holding the night air. Sarah washed her hands at the basin while Mara measured flour by touch and memory. The stove took coaxing, but the fire caught. By the time the dough rested, the baby had woken, and Sadie appeared in the doorway barefoot, clutching her doll. Sarah lifted Susanna with practiced ease, setting her in the cradle Owen had left near the hearth. "He must have brought it in last night." Mara didn't answer. She was kneading dough again, her brow furrowed. She hadn't asked for help, but he'd thought of it anyway. Later, with the bread rising, Mara stepped outside and found Samuel near the chicken coop, luring hens with broken corn. Owen stood by the east fence, watching the line of hills where wild horses sometimes crossed. Mara joined him, arms folded. "Samuel said you asked if he could help gather eggs." "I did. You don't have to find work for each of them." "I'm not. They're finding it themselves." She considered that. "He used to follow my husband around the forge, thought he'd learn the trade, but he was too young when the fire came." Owen didn't ask anything more. He just leaned against the fence rail and let her speak. "It took the barn first," she said after a moment. "We got out with what we could. My husband went back in for the gelding. Roof collapsed before he cleared the stall." Owen's hands tightened slightly on the fence post. "I buried my brother after a stampede broke his ribs. He'd roped the wrong steer too close to the gully. I still hear the horses cry when I close my eyes some nights." Mara looked over at him. He wasn't trying to match pain for pain. He was just setting his grief next to hers without pride or pity. "Does it fade?" she asked. "No," he said. "But it don't burn the same." She nodded once. By mid-afternoon, the bread was cooling on the sill, and the children were gathered near the barn, watching Stephen try to climb onto a hay bale without help. Owen passed by with a feed sack over one shoulder. "Fence out by the creek's leaning," he said. "Could use a hand setting it right." Mara blinked at him. "You think I've got time for fence work?" He paused. "No, but I figured you might want to be the one to tell it no." She eyed him, then rolled her sleeves higher. "Where's the post digger?" They worked in silence for a time, digging and resetting the posts. The soil near the creek was soft, made easier by recent melt, and Mara's boots sank more than once. Owen passed her the rail slats without comment, watching how she measured spacing by eye. "You always live in Kansas?" he asked. "Since I was 17. "Before that, Louisiana," she said, then added, "swamp country. My father carved cedar for a living." He nodded. "You sound more like the plains now." "Had to." By dusk, the fence stood straight again. Mara brushed dirt from her palms, her arms aching down to the bone, but it felt good earned. Owen leaned on the last post, his hat tipped back. "You've got away with wood," he said. "I've built worse with less." He studied her face, quiet for a long moment. "You don't flinch at hard things." She met his eyes. "I can't afford to." He gave a small smile, not wide but real. "That don't mean you have to do it alone." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That night, after the children were fed and sleeping, Mara sat outside on the stone step, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of warm water. She looked out across the land, wide, quiet, full of space that didn't press but invited. Inside, the cradle creaked gently as Sarah rocked the baby with one foot. Mara didn't know what to call this place yet. It wasn't home, not yet, but it didn't feel like nowhere. Behind her, the barn lantern flicked off. Footsteps passed in the dark, slow and steady, and then faded toward the corral. She didn't turn, but her fingers loosened around the mug. She would plant onions when the frost cleared, and maybe carrots too. By the third week, the snowmelt from the high hills had turned the creek sluggish and wide, leaving the pasture soft and green at the edges. Mara stood ankle-deep in the churned soil behind the house, sleeves damp to the elbows, a spade in one hand and a burlap sack of onions starts beside her. Sarah crouched nearby, pressing seedlings into the rows they'd drawn with taut string. Owen passed behind them with a pair of bridled colts, guiding them toward the training ring. "You've got a good line going," he said over his shoulder, not slowing. Mara didn't glance up. "I don't start a thing unless I mean to finish it." Sarah looked toward her mother, then back at the small green shoots in the dirt. "Will we still be here when they're ready to pull?" Mara wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "I don't leave living things half-grown." That night, after the children were settled, Owen found her on the porch with a tin of saddle soap and one of the boys' scuffed boots across her lap. The lantern beside her gave a pale circle of light, and her hands moved slow but sure, cloth working over the leather with care. "You always clean boots after sundown?" he asked, stepping up beside her. "I do what needs doing when I've got a quiet moment to do it." He leaned against the post, arms crossed. "You don't take many of those." She set the boot aside. "They aren't often mine to take." He nodded toward the cradle inside where Susanna stirred in her sleep. "Sarah says you used to sing her down." "That was before the burn took my voice more than I meant it to," she said. "Now I hum instead." He didn't press. Instead, he gave a small tilt of his head. "You ever ride for pleasure?" She looked up at him, startled. "I ride to get somewhere." "Never thought to ride just to do it." "There's a trail behind the butte, high enough to see the whole valley. Nothing pressing come morning. I'll saddle 2 horses." Mara leaned back against the rail, gaze steady. You always offer your trails to strangers. Only the ones who plant onions out back without being asked. At first light, the two of them rode out behind the barn, the horses moving slow through the damp grass. The air still held the hush of early hours, and neither of them spoke until they reached the rise. The view opened sudden, like breath drawn deep. The valley stretched wide, framed in cottonwoods, the creek winding pale against the dark soil. Mara drew her horse to a stop. I didn't know it could look like this. Owen dismounted and tied the reins to a low juniper branch. It did before you got here, but it looks different now. She didn't answer, just slid from the saddle, boots crunching against the loose stone. The wind pulled at her braid and she stepped to the edge, watching a hawk turn circles far below. You see yourself staying? He asked, voice quiet. Mara rested both hands on the saddle horn. There's room for the children to grow. That's more than we had before. But what about you? She turned to him then, eyes sharp. You think I came looking for anything more than shelter? No, he said, but I think you found more anyway. The silence between them stretched long. Then Mara walked slowly toward him, her fingers brushing the worn leather of her gloves. I haven't shared air with a man who didn't want something in a long time. Owen held her gaze. I'm not asking for anything, but you're waiting. Her voice was low but steady. I'll wait as long as it takes. She looked down at her hands. I don't know what I'd offer, Owen. I've got nothing untouched, and there's still nights I wake up expecting the house to be on fire. He stepped closer then, not touching her, just standing solid beside her. You don't need to offer anything. You're already here. They stood that way until the wind shifted and the horses stirred. Mara reached for the reins, her fingers brushing his. She didn't pull away. By the time they returned, the sun was high and Samuel had built a small pen for the chicks that had hatched that week. He waved them over, proud. Mara knelt beside the coop, praising the spacing of the slats, and Owen watched her from the porch, arms folded. That evening, Mara stood by the stove, stirring a pot of stew with one hand while the boys washed up outside. Sarah set the table without being asked, and Sadie passed spoons from hand to hand, humming softly. After the meal, Owen brought in a stack of books wrapped in cloth. Found these in the attic. My mother used to read them aloud when the weather kept us in. Mara opened one, fingers trailing the spine. You think the children would sit still for stories? They will if you tell them. Later, under the low glow of the oil lamp, Mara reads slow and steady, her voice rough around the edges but clear enough. The children leaned in quietly, drawn not just by the story but the sound of her speaking without weight behind it. Owen sat near the hearth, watching them all, his gaze resting soft on the woman who had come with nothing but her children and a scar, and now sat in the center of a room full of light. No one spoke of what came next. But it hung between them like the warmth of the fire, expected, steady, and slowly growing. The sky held rain by late week, a gray hush pressing close over the valley. Mara stood at the north cabin's threshold, a hammer in her hand, and the frame of a new door leaned against the wall beside her. The cabin had stood empty for years, its roof intact but its bones tired. Owen had offered to help with repairs, but she'd insisted on starting alone, and he hadn't argued. She measured the door frame twice before lifting the new piece into place. Sarah was inside, sorting through what furniture could be salvaged, while Seth and Sadie gathered kindling near the creek. The boys had taken to their chores without being asked, and Susanna, now crawling quick across any room, had started pulling herself upright on chair legs. The wind picked up as Mara drove the first nail flush into the jamb. Her braid stuck damp to her neck, and she rubbed her shoulder, pausing when Owen's voice called from behind. "You'll wear yourself down before dinner at that pace." She didn't turn. "It needs doing before the storm comes." He stepped closer, carrying a long-handled level. "You'll want this. The slope's off on the left side." She took the tool without a word and crouched to check. He was right. She adjusted the hinge board and straightened, rain spit just starting to fall. "Did you learn this kind of work growing up?" he asked. "No. I learned it after," she said, adjusting her grip on the hammer, "when there wasn't anyone else to do it." He nodded slowly. "There's a difference between being capable and being alone." Mara leaned against the wall, her voice low. "Some days, I can't tell if I kept going because I had to or because I didn't know how to stop." Owen set his palm flat to the wood beside her, not touching, just near. "You're not alone now." She met his eyes, the air between them thick with coming rain and things too long held quiet. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to know yet." He stepped back then, not far, but enough. "I'll be in the barn when the rain hits." By mid-afternoon, the storm broke. Mara stayed inside with the children, the cabin door newly hung and holding against the wind. Seth and Sadie sat on the floor, stringing buttons onto twine for a game, and Samuel repaired a harness with a needle thick as his thumb. Sarah rocked the baby, humming something low and steady. Mara stood at the window, watching the rain slice across the pasture in silver threads. She saw the barn door sway open, Owen stepping out with a blanket slung over one shoulder, heading toward the bunkhouse. She didn't call out. She just watched until he disappeared from view. That evening, when the sky cleared to a pale blue streaked with gold, Owen brought over a pot of salt pork and beans. He didn't knock. He just stepped inside and set it on the table, nodding toward Sarah. "She said you hadn't eaten yet." Mara wiped her hands on a towel. "We were waiting for the bread to finish. Sit if you want." He took the chair nearest the stove, letting the warmth seep into his boots. The room smelled of yeast and wet earth. The children gathered close, bowls passed hand to hand. No one spoke of the storm. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Owen lingered by the hearth, the last of the firelight catching the lines around his mouth. Mara stood beside the table, arms folded. "When did you stop waiting for someone to help?" he asked. "I didn't know I'd been waiting," she said. "I just stopped looking." Owen reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small folding knife, the wood on the handle worn smooth. He passed it to her. "It's not new, but it's sharp, for the fence wire or whatever else needs trimming." She turned it over in her hand. "Why give me this?" "Because I want you to have something that's only yours." She looked up, the lantern casting her features in soft shadow. "No one said that to me in years." He shifted, voice quiet. "Then it's past time someone did." Mara held the knife a moment longer, then tucked it into her apron pocket. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. That night after he left, she stood by the window again, the land outside dark and still. The fence he'd helped her mend last month stood straight against the twilight, and the garden rose, though damp, held firm. She touched the scar along her cheek without thinking, then lowered her hand. The wind had changed. It no longer carried ash or silence. It carried the smell of cut wood and bread cooling on a stove. And something else, something she had no name for yet, but could feel growing, slow and certain, like roots under thawed earth. The morning brought warmth that lingered, the kind that made the soil give easy underfoot. Mara stood at the edge of the garden with her skirts pinned up and her hands deep in the earth, planting beans in the last row she'd cleared. The children were scattered across the yard, Samuel and Stephen helping Owen with the new foal's enclosure, Sarah mending a hem with quiet focus on the porch, the younger ones chasing shadows near the creek under Sarah's watch. Mara paused to stretch, brushing dirt from her palms. She glanced toward the barn, where Owen stood leaning against the rail of the pen, watching Samuel loop a lead rope just as he'd been shown. The boy's face was set in concentration, but not fear. Not anymore. Owen caught Mara's eye across the distance and lifted a hand in greeting. She nodded once and turned back to her task, but her chest felt oddly light. She could not name the feeling, not exactly, but it had begun to settle in her like the slow thaw of spring, quiet and sure. Later, as the sun dipped lower, Mara carried a tin of biscuits to the barn. The smell of hay and warm horseflesh filled the air, and Owen was brushing the foal's flank with a steady rhythm. "They've cooled," she said, offering the tin. He took one, eyes glinting faintly. "Didn't expect you to bring supper out here. You've been out since midday." She leaned against the stall door. "I figured you'd forget until your hands started shaking." "I don't let things get that far." "No," she agreed, "you don't." He ate in silence, then set the tin aside. "There's a pair of chairs behind the cabin, faces west. You might like the view." She didn't answer right away, then nodded. "If you've got time to sit." He led the way without speaking, and they reached the back of the north cabin just as the horizon turned maple-colored. The chairs were simple worn pine, rough edges sanded smooth by age, but when she sat, the wood held her weight like it had been waiting for her. Owen sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. A hawk moved across the sky, black wings cutting the light. "You meant to stay, didn't you?" he said after a while. "I didn't know it until I'd already started," she replied. He turned toward her. "There's space here, in the land, in the quiet, but it's more than that now." Mara kept her eyes on the sky. "I never thought I'd have another home." "Not for myself. You've made one, not alone." He didn't speak, but his hand reached out. When their fingers touched, it wasn't uncertain. She let her palm rest in his, the warmth of it grounding. "My children are safe," she said. "They're learning again." Laughing. He looked at her then, steady as always. "And you?" "I'm not lost anymore." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything unspoken, everything that had been earned. That night, the children slept with the windows open, letting in the soft sounds of frogs and wind in the cottonwood. Mara stood by the hearth of the cabin, stirring the last of the day's wash-water, her shoulders loose with the kind of peace she hadn't known since before the fire in Kansas. Owen stepped inside without knocking. He hung his hat on the peg, then crossed the floor and took the basin from her hands. "You've done enough today," he said. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached for the towel and dried her hands, watching him finish the task with quiet efficiency. When he turned back, she stepped into his space and rested a hand on his chest. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "We make it," he answered. "Together." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, no hesitation, no words needed. They stood that way long enough for the fire to dim and the air to cool. When he kissed her, it was not rushed or uncertain. It was sure, like a promise made not with words but with hands calloused from work and hearts forged from hardship. By midsummer, the north cabin held more than just beds and dishes. It held laughter and chores shared, and the quiet moments when two hands brushed in passing and lingered just a little longer. The garden yielded beans and onions in straight, proud rows. Sarah wrote her letters with fewer misspellings, and Samuel could saddle a skittish mare without a second voice guiding him. On a still morning in August, Mara stood beside Owen outside the church in town, her hair braided back with a ribbon Sadie had chosen. The children were dressed in their best, faces scrubbed, hair slicked or pinned. The preacher said his words, brief and solemn, and Mara gave her vow with no tremble in her voice. Owen's vow followed, steady as the man himself. They walked back to the wagon as husband and wife, the small crowd offering nods and handshakes, but no one spoke too loud. It wasn't that kind of joy. It was deeper. Earned. Owen lifted Susanna into the seat beside Mara, then climbed up and took the reins. The horse started forward and the children followed behind on foot, kicking dust and laughing. That night, after the homestead settled quiet, they stood on the porch, watching stars bloom above the hills. "I never thought I'd have this again," she whispered. "You didn't get it again," he said. "You built it, from the ground." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "So did you." In the stillness, with the land stretching wide around them and the scent of cut hay on the air, they held each other. Not as people clinging to what they'd lost, but as two who had found something new, something lasting. And when the wind passed through the grass, it didn't sound like grief anymore. It sounded like home,